The military on the streets of certain parts of Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal, you've seen pictures of that through the day here. It does seem to be having an effect, no certainties. Rekgotsofeste Chikane is a lecturer at the Wits School of Governance. Rekgotsofeste, good afternoon to you. I mean, we have soldiers' boots on the ground. In a way, I think many people will see this as government trying to assert itself, and that's a good thing. It can also be a sign that the state has failed.
Yeah, I think it's both, right? So I don't subscribe to the idea of the SANDF should never have boots on the ground in any particular way, right? If we all acknowledge that the SAPS does not have the capacity to handle the situation, we can't throw our hands up in the air and say, well, we hope they grow the capacity within the next couple of days. So having the military involved in communities and the aspect of freeing up the SAPS to then do other activities in communities, I think is a good idea. But it does then beg the question of how did we get here in the first place, right? And this has been a long-standing critique of the SAPS for a long, long time. It's a long-standing critique around the economic injustices that exist within our society at a very systemic level. And these are the questions that we need to start asking of, why was it so easy to give people a blueprint for how you can create anarchy in the country? And they kind of stumbled upon it by accident, in my opinion.
Well, I mean, South Africa is, with the best will in the world, South Africa would be a difficult country to govern for many reasons, poverty and inequality chief among them. That said, there's certain things that you would like to think government could have done, and I suppose in a way it's impossible to critique the last 20 years of government without critiquing, I'm afraid, the governing party. But I mean, there are police failures here, there are economic policy failures that you've pointed to. I'm sort of struck by the State Security Agency and what seems to be internal battles there. There are also leadership failures.
I mean, it's all of the above. We could speak for hours on this, but I think state security first and foremost has to take a bit of responsibility on this issue of how did this happen? How did intelligence allow for this to happen? And how was intelligence caught flat-footed on this issue and has been reactive this entire time? It shows a systemic failure in the intelligence agencies, but we also know that this has been done over the past 15 years of South Africa's history, a systematic attempt to devalue that role of intelligence and make sure that it fights factional battles within the party. When it comes to other policies, the government knows that they've dropped the ball, right? There's very few people in the country who would say that our government has been a shining light of effective governance in any particular way. And now we're seeing the actual ramifications of it on national TV. So we all know we're the most unequal. We all know that the majority of the country lives in poverty, not kind of poverty, but firm poverty. So we've all known this as a society. Yet, like you said, for whatever reason, the country's just kind of stood firm over these last years, almost like it's an autopilot. But now we have the situation of, well, the cover's been taken off our eyes in a very violent, in a very militant, in a very active way. And the question is, again, why was it so easy to spark this? And that question is, if you ignore the problems in the country long enough, if you focus too much on internal fights within the ruling party and allow the ruling party's fights to create this type of chaos in the country, this is the situation that you land up in.
Is part of the problem what I suppose you would call social distance? There have been some people who've been in cabinet for a very long time. And I mean, you know, these are people with really great track records during the struggle, people who went to jail, people who suffered, people who were, let me put it in how I mean it, people who were leaders in their communities. They led their constituencies. They were respected. They did hard work for freedom. And now I don't know if they have the same, I mean, look at who's saying this, but I don't know if they have the same connection to the communities they're supposed to lead.
Yeah, I think, so I've been puzzling this over since the Fees Must Fall days. So as someone who was involved in Fees Must Fall, at some point, there was an active decision to say, though we respect the leaders of the past, we also acknowledge that the leaders of the past fundamentally don't understand the challenges that young people are facing, right? So, and we took that as a starting point. And you're kind of seeing that play out in different ways, that social distance, as you described, between those who sit in the highest offices of the country and what's actually happening on the ground. So we know that that divide does exist. The question then becomes of, is it just those particular leaders or is it the entire political establishment, right? And I don't think enough people are criticizing the entire political establishment, whether it is the ANC, whether it is the EFF, whether it's the DA, that underneath the leadership of these particular groupings, and obviously some of them haven't won elections, the country's been falling apart. Yet we keep playing the same game of hoping that someone within the political establishment will kind of come to their wits and say, I understand what's happening on the ground. I think there's a lot of platitudes. I think there's a lot of rhetoric that is thrown around. But I think there is a steep and stark divide between those who are leading the country and those who live their everyday lives in the country. And I think that's an issue of our economic system. I think primarily it's an issue of our political system that definitely needs to be reformed and changed. Because if we don't do that, then we're going to keep having these problems. So you're completely right. That social distance between the leaders and those on the ground is growing each and every day.
Rekgotsofeste, I mean, what you're pointing to, and I suppose what would strengthen your argument, although I'm not going to argue for you. I'm going to argue against you in a minute. But what would strengthen your argument is just the number of people who don't vote in elections, right? I mean, it's getting higher and higher. Now, this happens in democracies. You know, when you move from repression to democracy, the first election, as you know, I think we had like 96% poll or something ridiculous, and it starts to go down. And you see it with young people, and more our democracy is becoming more normal. I'm not saying that's a good thing, but more normal in that young people don't vote. But again, I'm struck, and I'm always struck by this. The four biggest parties in Parliament, the ANC, the DA, the EFF, and the IFP, all have their roots in pre-liberation politics. That tells us it's really hard to get a new movement, and Herman Mashaba will probably find this out soon, it's really hard to get a new movement in our politics.
Yeah, so we've now figured it out that to start a new party in the country means either you must break away from the ruling party and then be subsequently crushed, or become an amalgamation of a wing of that party in the form of the EFF being what the ANC Youth League wished it could become, essentially. And the EFF has clearly shown the only way that you can do that is if you have some sort of attachment to the party without really breaking away from the party. And it's an interesting dynamic for them. But it does pose the question of where's the space for new voices? Where's the space for new political movements? And without that space being created, right, within political spaces, within political institutions, you'll find these movements going outside, right? So I don't want to hop on fees must fall, but one of the things we said, and one of the biggest criticisms was fees must fall happen at institutions, at universities. My retort to that was, well, one day it's going to happen outside of the university space. And we're now kind of seeing that. But the problem and the difference is that what's happening outside of the university space, excluding the political maneuvering that is clearly happening, targeting key institutions and factories in the country, putting that aside for a moment, is that the looting and the unrest didn't have a clear leader attached to it. So the question then becomes, we do know that there's now energy for young people to create change. Whether that form of change is correct, I would disagree with looting, but we know that energy is there. Now we just need the leaders to tap into it. And the question is, are we going to let the leaders who've been in power for the past 20 years try and tap into it and fail, or will new spaces be created? How that looks, I have no idea, but I do believe it's possible.
Rekgotsofeste, I mean, you remind me of, I think it was a French philosopher who said, where are my people going? I need to lead them. And you know, it's such a sign that person didn't know. Rekgotsofeste Chikane, I really do appreciate the time. Thank you. A governor at the Wits School